What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Today, we have an absolutely terrific episode planned for you. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gabrielle Fundaro. Dr. Fundaro, how are you doing today?
I'm well. I am enjoying the winter weather here in Arizona, which is like summer in Michigan. So I love it.
Very jealous over here in Philadelphia. I just had Dr. Jamie Tartar on the podcast, who
Mhm.
was in Florida, and she reminded me that it was 82 degrees there while we were chatting. So
Oh,
very
wow.
jealous of the warm weather.
Yeah, I don't know. That's even a little bit warm. It's a little humid there. Like I have to say, Arizona, it stays pretty much 0% humidity and at like 75 degrees and sunny. It's pretty great because I was originally from the East Coast, so I had 17 winters in Michigan, so I totally feel you.
Yes, you certainly understand the pain, but that does sound lovely. I'm sure many of the listeners will be familiar with you and your work, but could you provide us with a little introduction and what have you been up to lately?
Oh man, I've been incredibly busy because every time I think I have a little bit of free time, I tend to fill it with stuff. So I would say in order from most recent, Shannon Beer, my amazing colleague and really good friend, and I are putting on the second iteration of the Bridging the Gap with Comprehensive Coaching webinar series. That is the way that we help to explain the origins and the application of the comprehensive coaching framework, which is a way for us to apply the attitude and skills of motivational interviewing, acceptance and commitment therapy-based interventions, and cognitive behavioral coaching to help clients really decide what changes are aligned with their goals, and then how to navigate the expected and unexpected obstacles that they may come across on their way to a more abundant, authentic, and flourishing existence. And along with that, writing quite a few articles this year on sort of the socio-political and historical origins of what we might call diet culture versus anti-diet culture. And finishing up the first iteration of the RP Strength gut health science book. So that's in the editing and graphics production phases. And hopefully that will be released at the end of this year. But the process of writing and editing is long and arduous. So yeah, so that's kind of what's going on lately.
I didn't know you were working on a book. I'm super excited about that for when that comes out. For the listeners, they might be thinking right now, there's a couple different ways this podcast episode could go, and this may or may not be disheartening depending on the things that the specific listener is interested in. But we're going to be sticking to the gut microbiome today, specifically the relationship between fiber and its impact on the gut microbiome. Now, to open up this discussion, something we talked about prior to going live is that the gut microbiome wasn't just at the heart of your fascination when it comes to the realm of nutrition, at least initially, but you dug pretty deep into the evidence on this. And tell the listeners about why you became interested in the gut microbiome, why you felt the need to really study this further.
Mhm. So I do have, I guess my origins are in the gut microbiome in the sense that I serendipitously began studying it during my doctorate. So my original doctoral research was looking at the effects of high fat feeding on skeletal muscle hypertrophy. And I was working in a lab that really studied skeletal muscle metabolism. And part of the way that we would cause dysregulation was to either inject mice or apply to skeletal muscle cells lipopolysaccharide, or LPS, which is a toxin that comes from certain bacteria in the gut. And I was curious about why we were doing that. What is the physiological relevance of applying this toxin or injecting these mice? And as it turns out, there are certain dietary patterns and disease states and physiological extremes that are associated with increased levels of LPS. And it binds to certain receptors of the immune system, some of which are found on skeletal muscle. And when that happens, it causes an inflammatory cascade that then leads to metabolic dysregulation. And that's called metabolic endotoxemia. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. Why aren't we kind of getting to the source? If it's coming from bacteria in the gut, why don't we figure out what's going on in there? Maybe we can stop that from happening. And initially, my PI was understandably a little bit hesitant because we were not a GI lab. We didn't really have the setup to look at that tissue. And as I came to learn, it is very different from studying skeletal muscle metabolism. There are all sort of, digestive enzymes and proteases and whatnot that really will bungle up your samples if you're trying to quantify proteins. So so my side project came up maybe about 6 months after I started my doctorate, and that was looking at the potentially protective effects of probiotic supplementation during high-fat feeding, and high-fat feeding is one of the situations that's associated with higher levels of LPS. So as it turned out, the initial project was canned because we lost the majority of the skeletal muscle samples, so we weren't able to study what we intended on studying. And so that side project became my main project. And I went on to continue that for several years because it took about 5 to finish my PhD. And then after that, I was like, okay, that's done with. Good thing I got that over with, because what I really wanted to do was teach. And so the PhD was sort of like a means to an end to an academic career. And 3 years into my academic career, Dr. Mike from RP found me in the ISSN Facebook group and recruited me to RP. And about a year after that, I realized I needed to make a decision between coaching full-time versus teaching full-time, because you can't really do both of those at the same time. And I decided to resign. And he came up with a really great idea that I could be, sort of the RP gut health expert, even though I use that term conservatively. But this was several years ago. It was a few years ago in 2017. And the gut health marketing was really blooming. So I think he predicted that it was going to be really big, and it really has grown, I think, exponentially in the past few years. And so that is really how I found my place as sort of an evidence-based voice in gut microbiome research. Not that there are not other excellent evidence-based voices and practitioners out there, but I think that in the realm of sort of fitness and bodybuilding, that there are relatively fewer. And even the amazing people who are on IG, a lot of them are researchers that are still heavily entrenched in research. And, having come out of the academic career and done the research, but now having more time, I can create content and do my best to communicate it effectively.
I love that. In terms of the fascination with gut health, it's definitely a popular topic at the moment. Everyone wants to improve their gut health. You'll have someone come to you and they're like, I want to improve my gut health. And it's like, oh, why? What's wrong? And they're like, well, nothing's wrong, but like I can improve it, right? Like it gets better. And it's like, I mean, if I knew what optimal gut health was, like the specific composition of the gut, that would mean like 100% A plus, like you can't get any better than this. And like, sure, it would be a goal, but like, we don't really know. We just have all of these like relationships. It's like, more diversity, good stuff there, decreased richness over here. Maybe don't follow that diet for like ever. And then that's kind of where like the line is. But assuming all of these views on gut health and what might work or what might not work, we come to fiber. And in the wild west, which is the nutrition space, there are some people that might argue you don't really need fiber, and fiber doesn't do much for the gut. But we're not going to have that conversation today.
Okay.
I think we're kind of on the same page here. Like most people could benefit from increasing their fiber intake. So with that being said, and when we look at the average fiber intake,
Mhm.
I commonly come across many clients that might say, whenever I increase my fiber intake or I eat a really healthy diet, I experience all of these gastrointestinal symptoms. And this is relative, right? What is high fiber? How much? Where are they coming from? What's their baseline fiber intake? But if we use the RDA recommendations as a goalpost, very generally, would you say that there are some individuals who might be intolerant of fiber or are unable to meet this general recommendation without experiencing these adverse gastrointestinal symptoms?
That's a really great way of putting it. I'm glad that you used the word intolerant, because technically speaking, we could say that all humans experience an intolerance to fiber if we define that as lacking the digestive enzymes required to break those long carbohydrate chains down into their monomers, which we can absorb. And there lies there's the rub, because if we are eating even an adequate amount of fiber, maybe even an inadequate amount of fiber, the types of fiber that we're eating vary in their fermentability, and that's really what's going to lead to GI distress. So, and from what I have seen, yeah, most people are probably on the lower end of fiber intake. The average intake in the US, I think, ranges from 15 to 19 grams per day. And in females, we recommend 25, and in males, we recommend 38. But yeah, there are definitely some clients who have recently gone about increasing their fiber intake or the variety of plants in their diet, and then they experience gas and bloating and changes in bowel habits. And or some people say, gosh, I feel like I'm doing everything right and I still feel crummy. And that really comes down to the fermentability of the fibers that they're taking in, because that's what's going to lead to the production of gas, and that's going to be associated with bloating and passing wind and whatnot. And then also the native inhabitants of the gut, those are also going to be a deciding factor in what's produced, whether we're going to be producing more gases or short chain fatty acids. And that's not something that we can really intentionally modify. So there's a sort of uncontrolled variable that there is going to be an individual response to fiber intake. So you've got a couple of factors, and you have your native microbiome, you have, and that, when I say that, I mean all of the microbial inhabitants, mostly bacteria, but there are also some methanogens and some other microorganisms in there that can contribute to that fermentation capacity. And then you have the amount of fiber that you're taking in, and then you have the type of fiber that you're taking in. So it's a lot, there are a lot of moving parts there. And for that reason, it's hard to say universally, like, this is the exact type and amount of fiber that everyone should be eating. We don't even actually know which microbes prefer which types of fiber or microbe accessible carbohydrates, which is kind of where our recommendation comes from, to just, eat a variety, because we're not sure who likes what.
Excellent. If we hone in on a couple of the things you said there, so for those without a diagnosed condition, right? So something like irritable bowel disease or experiencing some sort of flare up, most people, they can get there. They can probably, from where they're coming from, they can probably increase their intake and experience some benefits from doing that, depending on the specific goal they're after. But when it comes to potentially common problems or potential missteps when they go about increasing their fiber intake, it sounds like, for one, they might be introducing some novel foods, sources of fiber that are more fermentable, and that might be driving the symptoms. So we need to hone in on the specific foods that they're selecting. Another one might be maybe they're just increasing too much too quickly, right? So if they're starting at 20 grams, they're like, oh, let me just shoot the 40 tomorrow. Like there might be some consequences from that. Anything else come to mind, or do you want to expand on some of those points I just made?
Yeah, so the general recommendation for the rate at which we might want to increase our fiber intake is about 3 to 4 grams at a time. So if you're at 15 grams right now, you would go to 18 grams, hang out there for 1 to 3 weeks, see how you feel, and then increase again another about 3 grams. So it is a little bit of a time-consuming process. And in most cases, looking at people who increase their fiber intake, there seems to be a little bit of an adjustment period there that can last a couple of weeks, where they might see an increase in bloating and gassiness and flatulence. So giving themselves, the time to go through that, and warn family members and whatnot, and kind of ride that out, and then perhaps erring on the side of foods that are not known to be super gas producing, at least at first, and also not. I think sometimes people want to default to like a fiber supplement, and that might be not very cost effective. And also depending on the fiber supplement, in the case of something like methylcellulose, that's not really readily fermentable. So it's not going to be a great energy source for the microbes. But if we did something like inulin or chicory root, that's going to be incredibly fermentable and cause some GI distress. So, kind of erring on the side of, okay, maybe we don't totally, bump up our onion and garlic and cruciferous vegetable intake, but maybe we go for something like, some veggies, and adding some fruits, but, slowly over the course of a few weeks.
Fantastic. Recognizing that certain foods may or may not be driving symptoms in a specific individual, I think it's important here that if we consider someone who seems to be checking all of the right boxes, right? Their fiber intake's in a good place. There's a good diversity of fruits and vegetables and whole grains in their diet, and they're experiencing these symptoms. What would be some of the next steps we might take in order to attenuate these sensations that they're feeling? Maybe we might turn to some sort of elimination diet, whether that, and the severity of which is probably going to depend on what they're experiencing, whether we go all out to a low FODMAP diet or maybe just utilize a couple of the principles from that approach. Can you kind of walk the listeners through how they might trial a low FODMAP diet, or perhaps an alternative that's less severe that might be a good idea to start with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I like about the low FODMAP approach is that it really is customizable. There is sort of the traditional, more invasive and perhaps really efficient method of following a very low FODMAP diet for about 3 to 8 weeks. So that is really eliminating all foods that would be sort of moderate or high FODMAP at normal serving sizes, and then following a systematic testing process. So each group of FODMAP type is tested. So you would do like a fructose test, a lactose test, a mannitol test, sorbitol, and so on. And then a reintroduction based on one's response to the low, medium, and high serves of each FODMAP group. So that can take a few months. And in some people, it might be contraindicated. So because it is a little bit restrictive, a person who is already maybe in an uncomfortable place with their food relationship, that might not be, the best approach for them. Then there's FODMAP light, which is where we would remove just the really high FODMAP foods from a person's diet. So artichoke, onion, garlic, those are a few that come to mind. Honey. So the things that are really, really concentrated sources of FODMAPs, just eliminating those for a period of time and then reintroducing them one at a time and seeing how that feels. And in some cases, people may actually have a habitually low FODMAP diet. And in that case, they might be able to expand the dietary variety with more low FODMAP foods and really just eliminate maybe the 2 or 3 foods that they're eating that tend to be high in FODMAP and then reintroducing those. I had a few years ago, I was working with a client and I provide education on navigating that process. And it turns out they were eating like a few apples every day. And the rest of the diet was pretty low FODMAP. And it was really just the apples that were causing discomfort. And so we were able to expand the dietary variety and then realized, okay, it's just apples. So I think that also drives the point home that there are some of the foods that are really high FODMAP that cause GI distress are innocuous. We're like, an apple, avocados, but like those are so nutritious, and they really are. It's just that they're very high in these microbe accessible carbohydrates, or in carbohydrates that may have a laxative effect or pull a lot of water into the intestines. So it's not that they're causing harm or damaging the intestine. It's just that they have chemical properties that can cause some GI distress. So those are probably the easiest, like most straightforward approaches. After a person has gone through and gone to their gastroenterologist and kind of gotten everything checked out, and have a clean bill of health in terms of any disease state. But even with a person who has IBS-D, the low FODMAP intervention helps in about 75% of cases.
I really appreciate that context, especially the general timelines that you provided. I don't know if this is distinct to the fitness community, but I regularly see these recommendations to just full stop limit high FODMAP or even moderate FODMAP foods. And this makes me nervous to say the least. I don't think that, for some people, some foods in these categories may very well need to be restricted. They just don't tolerate these foods well. But to not give them a chance, or just without even documenting your experiences or getting a feel for whether or not these specific foods are driving symptoms, and just removing them, for the extent of time, I'm not so sure about that approach. And it seems like, especially in the fitness industry, there's this association that like any bloating whatsoever generated by a food will just have these like long-term consequences on the aesthetics of your physique. And like that's it, like you experiencing bloating on a daily basis, then your waistline is just off, it gets blown, and like that's something that shouldn't be utilized. So are you seeing similar things? What are your thoughts on some of these recommendations you're seeing in the fitness industry regarding these moderate to high FODMAP foods?
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, I think we have a spectrum, anything from, carnivore, which is like eating any plants at all, up to, I think maybe like low FODMAP, light, but forever, and so there's not a testing period. There's not an attempt to expand the diet. And I can understand that because, and I've worked with folks who are like, wow, I feel so much better. Like, do I have to do the part where I do the testing and I bring foods back in? I feel so great right now. I don't want to have to deal with that. And I can totally understand that. And, even researchers out of Monash and those who are associated with, the development of the low FODMAP approach, they recommend, avoiding a long-term adherence. And in part because they do see a reduction in some of the beneficial microbes, especially bifidobacteria. And so that's something of a concern. But, they do also admit, well, we don't really know the clinical outcomes of that reduction. Like it's probably not a great thing. We don't know what will happen long term. But I think, just the fact that we aren't certain about what's going to happen isn't necessarily fuel to say, oh, it probably doesn't matter then. And I think there's also just a psychological aspect to, someone's perception of not being able to eat a bunch of different foods, especially foods that they enjoy. And then their day-to-day becomes a diet of rigid restraint, and they never feel like they're not dieting. And I think that could, certainly be harmful long-term. So both of those aspects, thinking about supporting the diversity of the gut microbiome, but also thinking about, supporting psychological health and well-being. And generally both of those are associated with a more diverse and flexible dietary pattern.
Absolutely. Some extremely important points there. On the topic of GI symptoms, can you help the listeners make sense of these sensations? So that is, we've acknowledged that, due to these fibers, how fermentable the food is, there's likely to be some slight bloating or some gas. So to some people, they don't want to experience these things ever, as you alluded to, right? But are these bad things, or at what magnitude do these become sensations that are worrisome? How do we know if a food is generating too many symptoms or if it's perfectly acceptable?
That's a good question. I think to some extent it's going to be subjective. And we can also kind of think about our perceptions of sensations as being different from the sensations themselves. So that sounds really abstract, but I can explain it in the context of IBS. So individuals with IBS may have something that's called a visceral hypersensitivity. So that means when the gastrointestinal tract expands because of, or stretches because there's some gas production, or even just normal movement of feces through the GI tract, that the nerves surrounding the GI tract may send signals that are a little bit exaggerated. And our brain picks those up as pain. And so we may have a normal amount of gas production, a normal amount of distension in the colon, but we perceive that as pain because the signal that's sent is so strong. So that could be part of it, that maybe there's no real change in the amount of gas, but your brain perceives that and sends you a signal saying, "Hey, this is pain." So that's one thing to consider. And then, of course, some people have just a difference in their subjective ratings of discomfort. Some people are like, yeah, I'm just a gassy person. Like, and it's okay. I just pass wind a bunch all during the day. I know it's because I eat beans and whatever, and they're okay with it. And that might be distressing for another person who has a different set of expectations and standards for how their GI tract might feel, and if they feel comfortable passing the gas, or they feel like they have to kind of like hold it in, and then that causes a lot of bloating. So that's part of it. It's just like, what is your subjective perception, and how does your brain individually process the signals that are being sent from your GI tract? And that could vary with, IBS versus a person with normal signaling. If it gets to a place where the gas and the bloating are impeding a person's ability to perform or to eat food, absolutely, that I think that becomes a quality of life issue. Or if a person is experiencing really frequent loose stool, that could be a sign that they're not absorbing all of the nutrients in their food. Especially if they're seeing that it's like, if it's green in color, that means that it hasn't been in the GI tract very long. It hasn't been processed by the bacteria that leads to a kind of a normal brown color. So things like that might be indicative of one's dietary pattern reducing quality of life and potentially reducing nutrient absorption. And then in most cases, when people are experiencing constipation, it's not usually associated with fiber intake within normal ranges. But if people are maybe supplementing with a lot of insoluble fiber and producing a lot of bulk and not getting enough water, then they could experience constipation, and that can be, that can really make it difficult to eat and feel comfortable like in a lifting boat and whatnot. So a lot of it really comes down to affecting quality of life. To a lesser degree, it's about nutrient absorption, and to a much lesser degree, is it about like damage to the gut, like the gas and bloating and whatnot, or like bad gut health, or that we have bad bacteria in there. Really, even whether a bacteria is going to be pathogenic or not is subject to the context of the entire microbiota. So just kind of maybe hopefully that people can rest easier knowing that you don't necessarily have bad gut health. You are just feeding those microbes with a lot of carbohydrates that are fermentable, or pulling a lot of water into the intestines, and that speeds transit.
So what you're saying is the clear answer to the problems is not leaky gut.
Yeah. They might be surprised to learn that there actually was a recent, really thorough systematic review on some of the risk factors associated with increased intestinal permeability or leaky gut, or like situations in which you may have higher odds of having leaky gut, and it was not associated with GI distress.
Hey guys, Mike here. If you're interested in learning more about how to maximize your health, body composition, and performance, head over to hammerawayfitness.com, where you can sign up for coaching or even just schedule an hour consult with me to get some of your training and nutrition questions answered. Also, if you enjoyed this episode as much as I did and would like to further support the growth of the Muscle Memoirs podcast, you can give a donation to the link in the show notes, leave us a review, and or share this episode with your friends, whether that be dropping the link in a group chat or putting a screenshot in your Instagram story. I truly appreciate it. Very interesting. I want to highlight that point for the listeners there. Make sure to rewind from here and to listen to that again. But this relationship between the gut and the brain, it's such a complex dilemma, right? You would know better than I would, so correct me if I'm wrong here. But in terms of these gastrointestinal symptoms that people are experiencing, it may not even be the food itself, right? Because aren't there these like relative associations between something like depression and IBS? Is that correct? So there's all of these other factors that could be influencing these sensations that you're feeling.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's a really high concurrence between mood disorders and gastrointestinal symptoms, specifically IBS. So that means that quite a high percentage of people who have a diagnosed mood disorder, like anxiety or depression, will also have a diagnosis of IBS and vice versa. And we see that with disordered eating as well, and eating disorders, that chronic GI distress may be or could be potentially a red flag, sort of to say, like, perhaps there is some level of eating pathology going on, especially looking at chronic constipation. So that's been sort of a recent finding. There's not a lot of data yet looking at the microbial changes in individuals with eating pathology, but it really does go to show that there's a strong link between the gut and the brain that could absolutely influence GI symptoms.
Yeah, it all truly is fascinating, and just more and more research is coming out in this area, and it's exciting to follow it along. We touched on elimination diets here and utilizing a low FODMAP approach, and this can be a very tedious process, months long of initially restricting certain foods, but then we want to reintroduce them. We're going to do it one at a time to make sure we're controlling these variables and finding out the root of the initial cause, like what are these trigger foods. Is there anything else we can use to expedite this process? I think something that might be coming to most listeners' brains is some sort of allergy test. I'm not too familiar with the research on this. Are any of these efficacious in terms of getting to the root of what foods may or may not be triggering some of these symptoms?
Unfortunately, no. I think a lot of people are probably thinking of like an IgG food sensitivity test. Now, not to say that all tests sold as allergy tests are invalid. One can be screened for potential allergies. And there are both IgE mediated, which would be associated with something with like hives. One can be screened for those with something like a skin prick test. That's not a diagnosis. It just means that you may have an allergy to this thing. Or there are also non-IgE mediated food allergies, which would manifest as immediate vomiting or diarrhea. There's not really a screening tool for those. It's something you would need to meet with an allergist. In both cases, you need to meet with an allergist. They would collect your history and they would determine what kind of screening tool might be used, or whether it's sort of like an oral tolerance thing and you just track your symptoms like, wow, I ate eggs and then I immediately vomited. And that happened again the next day and the next day. So maybe we eliminate eggs and see if the vomiting stops. But when we look at something like an IgG food sensitivity test, that gets a little bit tricky. It is a test that is measuring IgG antibodies. So we could say that it is an accurate way of measuring IgG antibodies. The problem is that IgG antibodies are not indicative of an immune response, of a problematic immune response to a food. It's actually indicative of immune tolerance to a food. It is a recognition antibody. So when a person undergoes an IgG test, they receive back a list of foods that they eat frequently, and then they eliminate those foods. And then maybe they coincidentally eliminate something that was causing GI distress. And then we get a bit of confirmation bias there. It's great that they feel better, but now they've needlessly eliminated all of the other foods as well. And now they're left with lower dietary choice and dietary variety. Maybe then they experience weight loss because now they're eating fewer calories than they were before. And again, they think, wow, this has really helped. Like, I figured out my gut health. And people can be very unscrupulous when they say, oh, it's valid because it really does measure IgG antibodies. True, but that test is not actually testing for what it claims to be testing for. Food sensitivities are just a made up term. It's just an umbrella term. We have an intolerance, which is a lack of a digestive enzyme to break down foods, like lactose intolerance. And then we have the allergy, which is an immune response to a food. But a food sensitivity is just a made up thing, or sometimes people will use that word to refer to allergies and intolerances. But it's really important that we kind of recognize and discern the differences between those tests and screening tools. And if a person didn't want to necessarily go through the whole process of elimination and everything, an easy place to start is just with a food journal. So they eat a meal and kind of just, you don't have to be super, in depth on the amount that you ate and everything, but just list what you ate and then track how you're feeling in the next several hours. And then again, you list what you ate and you just track how you're feeling. So over the course of a week or two, you may then start to see that there are some patterns to your GI distress on days that you eat certain things. And then you can use your best judgment to figure out what food you might want to remove one at a time and then bring back in and see how you feel with that.
Excellent. Now, this episode may or may not be sponsored by Big Fiber, but in regard to certain populations that might benefit even more so from increasing their fiber intake, what comes to mind is, for weight loss, probably a good idea to increase your fiber intake. The positive effects on satiety can be useful for adhering to your diet. Another one that comes to my mind is perhaps most bodybuilders, and that might be a consequence of their relatively high animal protein intake. I'm not sure if anyone else comes to mind, or if you could expand on the research, which may or may not suggest that increasing fiber intake is particularly useful for people with a high animal protein diet. But let's have at it here. Your thoughts?
Yeah. I was like, when I first started talking about the gut, one person on Instagram said in like a derogatory way, "You're a strong advocate for fiber." Like, well, I mean, is that a thing? Is that like I don't know, a
Is it
contentious topic?
controversial? Like,
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I was like, I didn't think this was like a philosophical debate to talk about eating fiber, and a variety of plant foods. But I was fairly new to Instagram at the time, so I just didn't know. And now I can see clearly, it's super controversial. But yeah, I can't think of a group that would not benefit from ensuring that they're taking in adequate fiber from a variety of sources. I think that there would be maybe a couple caveats to considering timing and maybe where we would not want to have high fiber intake and reducing FODMAPs. So in individuals, especially endurance athletes, see this a lot, that they'll have some some exercise associated GI distress. And there have been some short-term trials looking at anywhere from like a 24-hour up to just a 2-week low FODMAP diet leading up to an important competition. And that seems to reduce some of the exercise associated GI distress in endurance athletes. So that might be, or even in just the pre-training meal, you don't necessarily need to overload yourself with a lot of fruits and vegetables and whole grains if you're going to be training in the next couple of hours. Or, if you're doing 2 training bouts back to back, that middle meal would very reasonably be more refined carbohydrates and, very little fiber, because that can cause some GI distress, for having a really fibrous, fatty meal. But you mentioned bodybuilders, and it was really interesting that in just recently, the end of last year, there was a group that has actually looked at trends in fiber intake in different types of athletes and how that correlates with microbial diversity and specific beneficial taxa. So they kind of already had this data that they were collecting over time, looking at, in cross-country runners, if they were eating a really high protein diet at the expense of fiber, they tended to exhibit lower levels of diversity. And then bodybuilders who were eating really high fat diets at the expense of dietary fiber, they saw reductions in bifidobacteria. So they were eating a diet of about a habitual diet of about 15 grams of fiber per day. So, it was pretty inadequate. And then recently they looked at probiotic supplementation in bodybuilders and sedentary controls. And although the probiotic supplementation didn't seem to have an effect on the microbial diversity of their fecal samples, what they found was that the bodybuilders who were eating inadequate fiber each day, their microbial diversity was very similar, was not any different from the sedentary controls. Whereas the people who were eating adequate fiber, they did see what we would expect to find with exercise as an increased microbial diversity. So that really indicates that fiber may be, if we're thinking of this like triad of fiber and physical activity and diversity, that if we have only one or the other, we're not going to fully realize our potential diversity. Because even if we're engaging in exercise, which is associated with more diversity, if we're not providing the nutrients for those microbes, they're not going to thrive. So that, I think, was some really compelling evidence to show that, we really do need to be thinking about having a balanced approach to our dietary pattern. That, if we're going to have higher protein intake, then we want to make sure that we're also having concurrently higher fiber intake. And there's so Dr. Megan Rossi, I think she's the gut health doctor on Instagram. Her group years ago looked at individuals with, I believe it was chronic kidney disease, and found that the protein to fiber ratio actually mediated the amount of p-cresol, which is a byproduct of amino acid metabolism by bacteria that's associated with GI disease and colorectal cancer. They don't know what the actual ratio is that we need, that we should really be shooting for. But when we are providing the microbes with microbe accessible carbohydrate, they do preferentially use those. They can use amino acids, but the problem with that is that the products that can accumulate, like cresol and indoles, are associated with colorectal cancer. So it might be that, maybe not causative, but if we're kind of thinking long-term, big picture, and supporting health, then it's a good idea to not necessarily not to go vegan, but to ensure that we're having that adequate dietary fiber.
That's super interesting. Corresponding with this, there's a pretty recent paper discussing the gut muscle axis. And this is preliminary, right? It's not set in stone. We definitely need more original research to kind of facilitate these points and see the magnitude of effect that we're working with here. But, when we consider all these already beneficial effects of fiber, when I have athletes come to me and they have such a low fruit and vegetable intake, I'm like, hey, we need to get that up. And it's like, oh, well, here's 20 reasons why you definitely should. And they're still like hesitant. Like, I really want to be able to throw out to these people. It'll make you more jacked too. And then like, maybe people will be like, all right, I'm definitely going to get at least five servings in per day. That's my hope. I hope to see more research in this area to support that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really do think that there is an ever increasing strength of evidence to illustrate that there is a bidirectional effect between exercise and the microbiome. And then, like I mentioned, that triad and diet as well. So a prudent diet supports our ability to exercise and train, and recover. And that supports a diverse microbiome. And the diet also supports the diverse microbiome. And there are now some bacteria that have been associated with improved exercise performance, like Veillonella. And there's, Bacteroides, maybe B. fragilis. And they metabolize, either in the case of Veillonella, it metabolizes lactate. And produces propionate, which is a short-chain fatty acid that's associated with increased exercise performance in rodents. And in the case of B. fragilis, it produces glucose. And so it is taking something for us, alpha cyclodextrins and things that are not really readily available to us, in terms of that energy stored in a compound, and it is producing something that is available to us. So the microbes are enhancing energy harvesting from the diet on our behalf and for themselves too. So there is really a beneficial relationship. And like you mentioned, with the gut muscle axis, looking at the effects on, I believe it was IGF-1, so if we are, and that was kind of, they related to that to age-related muscle loss too. So sarcopenia over time. We also tend to lose microbial diversity over time as well. So I think anything that we can do that could potentially support microbial diversity and our exercise habits and all of these other, beneficial effects like, why not do that? Except that, you read some book that a guy wrote about why not to eat fiber. I don't want to like poo-poo on people's creative ideas and whatnot, but we have to be able to accurately interpret and evaluate the literature, I think, if we're going to, write a whole book about a dietary pattern that contains no plants.
I love those thoughts. More food for thought for the athletes and coaches listening on why it might be a good idea to increase your fiber intake a little bit. As we wrap up this episode, Dr. Fundaro, I want to touch on artificial sweeteners.
Ah,
For some reason, we just can't have nice things. I'm not sure why that is, but when it comes to, having a Diet Coke, it's like, oh, well, the research supports that like it does not impact weight loss effectiveness. If anything, it can improve your ability to lose weight by being able to have a diet beverage. And then it's like, well, artificial sweeteners cause cancer. And it's like, oh, it's kind of based on like a rat study in the 80s, and they metabolize saccharin differently than humans do. So it's not really. And it's like, well, if you drink a Diet Coke, you're going to wreck your gut microbiome. And it's like, oh, I guess that's what we have to battle in 2021. Last time I checked, there wasn't much research to support that any of the artificial sweeteners had a superb deleterious effect on the gut microbiome, especially if we're looking at the most often used ones, which are sucralose, and then I think that's followed by aspartame. But update the listeners here. Where does the research stand in terms of artificial sweeteners and their effect on the gut microbiome?
Yeah, no, you've definitely got it right. It follows suit, that we kind of get the reemergence of these like new things to be afraid of. And likewise, anything else that we study, if we want to publish something with significant deleterious effects, we apply it to cells, right? Anything in cell growth, you can kill cells by doing nothing. Like you can just feed them with what they need and they'll just be, and they die. And if you want to make it a little more believable, you do it in rodents, but you give them a super physiological dose that humans could never ingest. And rodents also, just as they get old, they just get tumors. Like they just, they're super inbred and they're not robust creatures. But if you really want to see what's going to happen in a human, then you can feed this stuff to humans. And what we find is that across the board, I think some people they mention, gut hormones, that they're afraid they're going to, mess with the gut hormones and whatnot and throw that off. And that hasn't been shown. And then in terms of the gut microbiota specifically, again, yes, there have been some cell culture models and there have been some rodent models where we have seen some changes to certain taxa with doses of these artificial sweeteners that are just not reasonable. Or in the case of sucralose, when ingested by humans is cut with dextrose or maltodextrin. We get a really, really small amount of the actual sucralose. And that's not the case when we're looking at rodent studies. The other thing that happens that I think is an often missed detail, and something that I really just happened upon in the past 6 months maybe, is pseudo-replication. So people will take a fecal sample from a human donor, and then they will place that into 5 different mice. And then they'll have those mice, will receive some sort of intervention or they observe them, and they'll count that as an N of 5. But those mice were germ-free and they have been colonized by just one human's fecal sample. So that's considered pseudo-replication because it's not truly an N of 5, it's an N of 1. And we've just put that into 5 different mice. And so that's another limitation because human microbiomes are really individual. And so I think that's the other aspect is, when we're looking at an individual response, that might be important to that one person. But then when we pool all the data and we say, okay, well, there are actually 10 people in this group and only one of them experienced any changes to the microbiome, like, does that really matter? And sometimes people will take just that. There's one group that I know of that took like that. So those responders, the 3 people who saw some changes and transplanted that into mice. There was no control group, and that sort of exploded. And it was like, oh, sucralose is, so bad for you, and it causes, insulin perturbations and whatnot. But when you like pare down, you actually look at like how that was that study was constructed. It's really not strong evidence. So, and that's really the only case where they saw that there were things of potential concern. But when we look at human data with a control group that is, a well-controlled double-blind RCT, we find that there really are no effects on the microbiota. And it makes sense because those are either, in the case of aspartame, it's just a dipeptide, 2 amino acids. So if they're going to metabolize it, it'll be like any other dipeptide. But in most cases, these are just compounds that the bacteria don't really care to interact with, and they're fairly inert. And so they just pass through and they're excreted or they're lost in the urine. Where we do see an effect would be with sugar alcohols. So some sugar alcohols are naturally occurring. Most of them are fermentable, except for erythritol, and they'll have a laxative effect. So stevia and lactitol, xylitol, if it ends with an ol, it's a sugar alcohol. So those could have a laxative effect and cause some GI distress and be metabolized by the bacteria. To what end, we don't know. But if you are eating a lot of sugar alcohols and you're having GI distress, that's a number one contender for what's probably contributing to it.
Wonderful. Dr. Fundaro, that's all I have for you today. This has been a terrific discussion. I really appreciate your time. For our listeners who want to go and support you, learn more about you, where can we point them towards?
Oh, that would be fantastic. I always like when people are connecting and asking questions about their poop and stuff. So Vitamin PhD, that's my handle on Instagram and Facebook. And then I also have vitaminphdnutrition.com. And if they're interested in the coaching side of things, how do we inform people about these misconceptions without causing them to feel silly for believing something? That would be btgcomprehensivecoaching.com.
And all of those links will be in the show notes. If you're not following Dr. Fundaro on social media, you need to. She's putting out all of the nuance, something that is unfortunately lacking in this space nowadays. So go check her out. But that does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs podcast. Thank you so much for listening, everyone.